Hi, hello, good morning in Mexico, good afternoon in South Africa. My name is Arturo Mendoza. I am the director of the Mexican Studies Center. We are representing the National Autonomous University of Mexico in South Africa, and we are located at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. Welcome everyone to our webinar series, South-South Dialogues. The aim of this webinar is to address existing and emerging challenges pertinent to the developing world, and to discuss subjects of international concern and research from the perspective of the Global South. Likewise, we intend to foster conversation, reflection, and debate between academics from UNAM and South African institutions of higher education. Today's webinar is Mexico and South Africa's Development Diplomacy, Scaling Up South-South Triangular Cooperation. South Africa is the largest African provider of development cooperation on the continent, and an important actor in the changing international development landscape. While being a middle-income economy that still faces poverty, inequality, unemployment, and other domestic challenges, it also has harnessed a wealth of experience and specialized know-how that it now shares it in support to other developing countries. Strategically positioned as an important gateway to Africa, serving as a member of the BRICS and the G20, and a provider as well as a receiver of development cooperation, Pretoria is making a unique contribution to post-conflict reconstruction in Africa and to the global development architecture. It maintains a strong African orientation as well as a leadership role in South cooperation, while also being a prominent center for triangular cooperation with Northern donors. Our participants in this talk are Dr. Philani Mthembu, Executive Director of the Institute for Global Dialogue in South Africa, and Dr. José Luis Gazquez, researcher at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. Okay, now I'm going to read our guest bios. Dr. Philani Mthembu is the Executive Director of IGD, an independent foreign policy think tank based in Tshwane, Pretoria, South Africa. Prior to joining the Institute for Global Dialogue, he pursued a joint doctoral program with the Graduate School of Global Politics, Freie Universität Berlin, Germany, and the School of International Studies at Renmin University in Beijing, China. The focus of his dissertation was on the rise of emerging powers as sources of development cooperation in Africa, for which he was awarded magna cum laude. He co-founded the Berlin Forum on Global Politics, a non-profit organization dedicated to the promotion of academic, expert, and public understanding of global politics. While completing his master's in international relations at the University of the Witwatersrand, Johannesburg, he headed the academic development program for first-year students and was elected as the first independent candidate to the Student Representative Council. Welcome, Dr. Philani Mthembu. Dr. José Luis Gazquez works closely at the University Program in African and Asian Studies at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, and he holds a PhD in International Relations from the Autonomous University of Madrid, and a bachelor's and a master's degree in Political and Social Studies from the Institute of Political Studies in Paris. He has carried out research and fieldwork stays at the Institut Fondamental d'Afrique Noire of the Cheikh Anta Diop University of Dakar, Senegal. He is a member of the Mexican National Research System, and he is also a member of the Group of African Studies at the Autonomous University of Madrid. Dr. Gazquez currently works as a full-time professor affiliated with the Center of International Relations of the Faculty of Political and Social Sciences of the National Autonomous University of Mexico. Welcome, José Luis. Now I will give the floor to the participants. For those who are watching us on our social media on Facebook, and if you wish to participate with comments or questions, please use our Facebook chat box to do so. We will have time for questions during our last part of our webinar. Thank you very much. And now I give the floor to Dr. Philani Mthembu. Thank you.
Thank you very much, colleagues. Thank you for putting this discussion together. I think this is the advantage. Here I sit in South Africa and Jose sits in Mexico, and we can have this exchange on South-South cooperation, and particularly on Mexico and South Africa's development diplomacy. And what I'll be speaking to is really the opportunities of scaling up South-South and triangular cooperation. And what I think South Africa can also draw from Mexico, but also the type of mutual exchanges that I think we could definitely have in taking our South-South cooperation forward. What's important in contextualizing where South Africa sits in terms of its development cooperation, it's important to first think of where we are currently and then go back slightly and then forward in terms of where South Africa is trying to get to. So here we've entered the sort of so-called decade of action, where we've entered the final decade of the Sustainable Development Goals, where we should have eliminated extreme poverty throughout the world by 2030. Now, we sit in a precarious situation because we've been hit by a pandemic which has had the hardest impact we've had essentially in 100 years. And this is also comes at a period where essentially for the first time since the United Nations Human Development Indicators began to be used, for the first time, the human development indicators have either stagnated or have gone backwards in this 2-year period of the pandemic. And this is something that is quite important, and it's something that we have to reflect on, because what it means is that it will make it much more difficult for us to actually achieve the Sustainable Development Goals that we have all committed to by 2030, especially in the face of the pandemic, in the face of high unemployment rates, in the face of an unequal opening of the global economy, and also in the space of an unequal distribution of vaccines globally. So we are facing quite a challenging time. And I think if we are to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, then actors like South Africa and Mexico will have to play an important role in promoting and upscaling their South-South cooperation, but also in upscaling the possibilities of triangular cooperation. A country like South Africa does have a relatively long history when it comes to the role it plays as a source of development cooperation or a source of development finance. But that history largely resembles what has happened within the country. So for instance, during the apartheid period, where we had white minority rule, we had a very unilateral government in power, you had development finance and you had development cooperation, but it was largely dispersed to the few countries that were not isolating the then apartheid regime. And what happened when the country went through its democratic transformation after 1994, you had a lot of thinking within the foreign policy community around how could South Africa reposition itself in Africa, in the global South, but also in the global landscape. And this caused stakeholders within the state and outside the state to think very hard about reforming South Africa's role as a source of development cooperation. That led to the African Renaissance Fund. In its full name, it is basically the African Renaissance and International Cooperation Fund. And when the new government essentially initiated and operationalized the African Renaissance Fund, it was very much with a view of repositioning South Africa within Africa, but also within the global South. And it was also about ensuring that there are resources that South Africa would put in order to show its solidarity to fellow countries within Africa and within the global South. And that was very much, it also takes us to the name of the African Renaissance Fund. And it had that in mind. It had in mind the idea of catalyzing the African Renaissance, but putting resources. Now, South Africa's development cooperation has largely been decentralized in a sense that South Africa does not have a centralized organ or institution that is in charge of South Africa's whole international development cooperation. So even with the onset of the African Renaissance Fund, you would find that the African Renaissance Fund was not managing all of South Africa's development cooperation. You had a decentralized approach, and therefore you had the South African National Defense Force also was responsible. You had the South African Police Services, you had local and provincial government, you had Department of Trade and Industry, Department of International Relations and Cooperation, and you have a whole range of stakeholders at a national level and also at a subnational level that are in charge of South Africa's international development architecture. And therefore, you also with that, of course, came opportunities in a sense that departments could engage in international relations on their own, but also it came with challenges of coordination in the South African landscape. And therefore, when it comes to actually quantifying South Africa's development cooperation, it becomes rather difficult because you do not have a central definition that within which everyone prescribes to. So those are some of the challenges when it comes to South Africa's development cooperation. It's really areas of coordination, but also areas of actually quantifying what do we mean by South Africa's development cooperation. So for instance, when the South African National Defense Force intervenes as part of a United Nations or as part of a SADC, the Southern African Development Community, or as part of the African Union, do we count that as part of our development cooperation? When there are certain concessional funding that comes from your development bank of Southern Africa, or that comes from your industrial development corporation, the challenge has been at times to really say whether this is part of South Africa's overall development assistance or whether it is not. But I think in general, we can agree that all of those tools form an integral part of South Africa's overall South-South cooperation. And I think this has been quite important in the post-1994 landscape. I want to read something to you, which was, mentioned in a book by Adebayo, where he begins his analysis on South Africa's role in Africa in the post-apartheid era by asking the following questions. Can a country that has brutalized and exploited its own people and those of surrounding countries go on to become a credible champion of human rights, democracy, and sustainable development on the African continent, even after a remarkable political transformation? ? To what extent has South Africa been liberated to play a leading role in Africa? And to what extent is it still crippled, not only by the past, but by the widely varying priorities of its population. How have these dynamics played out in the years since the Rainbow Nation stepped out of its own shadow in 1994? And I argue that the inception of the African Renaissance Fund and the very idea behind the African Renaissance Fund was primarily about answering these types of questions, about where to place South Africa in a changing international landscape and where to place South Africa once it had actually gone through its transition into a democratic country. And some of the projects that South Africa has supported through the African Renaissance Fund in years gone by have included projects worth millions to help Zimbabwe in 2007 and 2008 with their local and parliamentary and also presidential elections. There's also been projects that have been supported, for instance, in the Comoros, supporting armed personnel to provide security during the presidential elections. You've also had South Africa's involvement in the Democratic Republic of Congo, specifically also in the water supply scheme in Katanga province. And you've also had various trilateral or triangular cooperation partnerships where South Africa has partnered with the likes of Vietnam on efficient rice production in Guinea. Also, some of the projects that you've had, for instance, is projects in Lesotho, which of course we know plays a very important role, but also is an important source of the water resources, not only in South Africa, but also in the region. So South Africa has supported projects in Lesotho, such as the Sunny Top to Mokotlong Road project, which created a major trading link between Lesotho and the port of Durban, and also the Metolong Dam project in the Maseru district in Lesotho. I'm highlighting some of these projects just to get an idea of some of the projects that South Africa has supported. Some of them involve electoral support and where countries are emerging from conflict and are moving into elections. Some of them are including areas such as your food production and sustainable production of various crops. And of course, also in terms of infrastructure projects that South Africa has supported within the region. But also South Africa has also played a role, for instance, within your IPSA, your India, Brazil, and South Africa forum, where through the IPSA forum, which is administered by the United Nations Office on South-South Cooperation, you've had a number of projects supported across 37 countries in developing countries, many of them in Africa, which are looking at various areas, whether in the technology space, whether in agriculture, whether in peace and security and governance issues. So South Africa has been quite involved in those areas. But I think where South Africa can now have a conversation with Mexico is in the area of actually transitioning towards supporting an institution that manages South Africa's development cooperation and South-South cooperation. Because Mexico, for instance, has created an institution such as Amexid, has put it into law. But in the South African case, there has been a move towards establishing a South African Development Partnership Agency. And the South African Development Partnership Agency would essentially be the key coordinating structure that manages South Africa's overall international development assistance. So it would manage South Africa's South-South cooperation, but it would also manage South Africa's triangular cooperation. And the added advantage there is that it would be given the responsibility to also coordinate across different departments and to create a centralized database of South Africa's international development partnerships, so that South Africa is able to firstly define what it means by its development cooperation, but then to also quantify its development cooperation. And by quantifying, I think it's important to note that South Africa would not necessarily be monetizing all of its development cooperation. So there are various areas, for instance, where South Africa works with other countries in the global south, where you do not necessarily quantify it in monetary terms, but where, of course, it has an impact in other countries, whether it's in the form of poverty alleviation, whether it's in your aid for trade schemes, or whether it's in the realm of peace and security. There's a very important role there for a structure such as the South African Development Partnership Agency. And I think it would be important for South African stakeholders to have a conversation with our counterparts in Mexico at different diplomatic tracks. So both at a state-to-state level at track 1, but also amongst your research institutions and think tanks at track 2, and then also among civil society organizations at track 3. And I think we need to then have this conversation to say what have been the positives and what have been the challenges in the Mexican experience. And of course, also in contrasting the manner in which Mexico engages, for instance, within the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, whilst at the same time trying to maintain its identity as a country of the global south and championing South-South cooperation. So I think it would be very interesting to open those channels of communication between various stakeholders in South Africa and in Mexico, especially at a time where South Africa has been saying it is on the verge of establishing the South African Development Partnership Agency. Lastly, sort of moving towards the closing, is that we have just recently come from the BAPA Plus 40, which was held in Argentina. And that really gave, highlighted the importance of South-South cooperation, but also of triangular cooperation when it comes to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think it's going to be quite important to see the role that South-South and triangular cooperation can play in meeting many of the goals that are outlined in this final decade of action as we move closer towards our target in 2030 of completely eradicating poverty. And there we would have to learn from other countries in the global south of what are some of the positive experiences they have had, both as recipients of development cooperation, but also as increasingly as sources of development cooperation. And what kind of institutional frameworks have they set up within their countries that enable them to play a proactive role in the provision of global public goods. And I think if we can have that conversation at multiple tracks of diplomacy, it would actually enrich both South African stakeholders who are involved in South-South cooperation, but it would also enrich stakeholders in Mexico and in other countries of the global south. So maybe with those comments, colleagues, let me leave it there and look forward to any sort of follow-up questions by both Jose and the viewers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Philani Mthembu. Jose Luis, please, I give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Arturo. Good morning to everybody here in Mexico. Good evening in South Africa. I first want to thank Arturo and UNAM South Africa for inviting me to participate in this very interesting webinar with my colleague Philani. First of all, I would like to ask a question to Philani because my network went a little bit down when he was speaking about tracks of operation. The last one because my network was a little bit down. If you can just repeat it before I start my presentation.
Perfect. I can definitely sort of elaborate there. So I think what the key point there was that I think we need to encourage that engagement at the different diplomatic tracks. So to ensure that, yes, at the formal track one, government to government, that those engagements continue, especially between officials, for instance, that are managing South Africa's African Renaissance Fund and those that are tasked with shifting and establishing a South African Development Partnership Agency. So I think there we need a continued open line, but also I think we would benefit from a deeper track two diplomacy amongst an engagement amongst researchers, amongst think tanks, and also academic institutions. I think there's a lot of joint research that we can actually encourage to learn from the Mexican experience, but also to learn from the South African experience in South-South cooperation. And then lastly, with track three, among civil society actors and grassroots movements, I think there is also value to have that exchange between South Africa and Mexico, and just learning both from the positive examples, but also learning from the challenges of our respective countries. And I think we would all stand to gain by encouraging a multiple track form of engagement when it comes to South-South cooperation.
Thanks, Philani. I just missed the third one. It's very important that you repeat it to me because I'm going to go back to this third track in a minute. I would like to, my talk is going to center around the question of development, and I'm also referring to the South-South cooperation, but I would like to approach the issue from a more theoretical standpoint. So I would like to start by precisely by questioning the economy and development as the Western model has been imposed in the rest of the world. I think that there is nothing in the economy that is not political. That is why, for example, Marxist scholars prefer the term political economy. And then other thinkers, decolonial thinkers as Latin American decolonial thinkers as Ramon Grossfogel and other decolonial African thinkers have gone even further, proposing a decolonization of the political economy itself, of the discipline, based on the argument that the concept still retain its Eurocentric, dualistic, and hereby atomizing thinking and privileging economism instead of opening up to realities of power, and processes of how power creates knowledge that frames what is known as politics, economy, and society. I was thinking, for example, in the calculus of the GDP, that this calculus leaves out of important dynamics such as domestic or informal economies that I think that in the case of South Africa and in the case of Mexico are they are very important. They represent an important percentage of the overall economic activity. So the one for discussion is that what appears on the surface as the problem of political economy and development challenges for either Africa and America are in fact rooted in the epistemic domain. The predicament, I think, for these regions is an epistemic one, because we try to use Eurocentric epistemology and Eurocentric model development in our struggles for decolonization, and thus we separate ourselves from this classical economic thinking. No, there are also other writers, other thinkers from Latin America and that talk continuation of colonialism by other means. No, the colonial control still have a control over a lot of monopolies in capitalist economy, as the monopoly on technology, on global financial flows, for example, the access to the resource in the planet, the control of media, the possession of weapons of mass destruction. So, for example, accordingly to Samir Amin, the only possible science is the science of society, because society, the social reality is one. We cannot separate the economic dimensions from the political or the ideological ones. This concept of the economic theory as abstracted from reality, it's a clear obstacle for thinking in other ways of development. Also, the Kenyan philosopher Ngugi wa Thiong'o also stated that, for example, Africa has been a slave during all the phases of capitalism, beginning with the slave trade, continuing with the slave plantation, afterwards with colonialism and the race for raw materials, and nowadays with the slavery produced by debt. So there is no, accordingly to this perspective, there is no modernity without coloniality. There's no, always this rhetoric of modernity and development is hiding the other side of the system. For example, the issue of peripheralization, that was very popular among the dependency theory. It's still very much at play. Peripherization is still a technology of coloniality that works by ensuring that the peripherized remains inside the orbit of modernity and coloniality to service capitalist patriarchal logics, but is always pushed to the margins of power and influence. Also, at the political level, it must be stressed that dual of entry and exclusion of Africa from the developing a new nation-state sovereignty system that emerged during the 16th century made the continent available for partitioning during the Berlin Conference. So Europe developed an epistemic hierarchy that privileges Western knowledge and cosmology over non-Western knowledge and cosmologies, and institutionalized in the global university system a linguistic hierarchy between European languages and non-European languages that privilege communication and knowledge and theoretical production in the former, and has subalternized the latter as sole producers of folklore or culture, but not knowledge or theory. So what is important also to highlight of this worldview and consequently of these development models is that they have their origins in the early centuries of capitalism. No, it has its origins in these first centuries, as Ndlovu Gacheni, a Zimbabwean philosopher, calls the paradigm of discovery, at work at least since this century, from a Western perspective, the discovery of America then cascaded, provoked the imposition of this mercantilist order, the first phase of capitalism. If we look closely at the important economic actors at this time, we can see that there were all sorts of European companies operating in the African continent, but these African societies and African space was not regarded as a political unit as the nation state in Europe. It was a place where the main goal was to obtain resources. So for the outside world, the importance, for example, of the Peace of Westphalia that was signed in those years, precisely in 1648, lay not in the reciprocal recognition of the sovereignty of others, but in the fact that if Europeans had considered African sovereignty in the same way they did their own, the Berlin Conference would not have happened at all. So this in turn helped us to raise the issue of development of Africa and other post-colonial regions through the lenses of historical meaning of the impact not only of the European colonization process in Africa and Latin America, but I think more importantly to the decolonization processes. For example, in Africa Must Unite by Kwame Nkrumah, he was already worried internally for Nkrumah was precisely this fragmentation, this balkanization of African countries, of African political units into weak states. No, so I want once again to stress that this situation is the result of an imposed model of development from the outside. Not African or Latin underdevelopment, for example, are purely circumstantial or attributed to tactical errors by the third world. There are also some circumstances that made us think of an impossibility of autocentric development at the periphery of the system. We could do, what could be done? What could be done to envision a reversal of this situation and redirect energies toward alternative models of development? It is necessary, above all, as Philani argues, in us cultural dynamic work to the benefit of these continents. That's why it was important for me to recall this third track that you were talking about, because I think it's there that we have to invest a lot. We have to invest a lot in each other, in knowing a Mexican perspective to dynamics of African society and vice versa. Also, the African countries and societies investing more in knowing and studying the Latin American societies and history in order to identify these historical trajectories, the parallelism, and identify also some opportunities. So I would like to conclude that it's important to highlight that in contemporary African or Latin American societies, we can still notice a survival of certain characteristics of traditional culture, especially regarding those that have something to do with spending in activities or in symbols. These logics do not answer exclusively to a capitalist behavior, and they are the proof that of the need to take into consideration local cultural dynamics, as I have spread before, because what how do you say, the African societies and Latin American societies as states are not defined by this capitalist logic entirely. No, there are a lot of there is a lot of influence of culture in the vision, in the world vision of these societies, and then the economic development models should take into consideration these traditional practices and how to adapt them to the modern life. So I would leave it there for more feedback from Philani and from the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jose Luis. Well, I would like to open the floor for the two of you to exchange ideas. I'm sure that you have quite a few questions to ask. So I have some questions here, but first I would like to give the floor to you, colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this was really quite fascinating. And I think the two discussions were complementary, because I think mine was focused more on the, let's say, the nuts and bolts on how countries in the South are establishing infrastructure for South-South cooperation. But I think Jose takes a very important view here, where he takes us back and says, hold on, how do we define development? What is development? Development to who? And what is that process? You know, because often, I mean, a lot of the concepts and the terms that are used, you know, developed country, developing country, you know, concepts which were used in the past, you know, such as first world, third world, and all of that, you know, sort of, it speaks to who has the power to define. Who has the power to define who needs, you know, development, and who has the power to define what solutions are even presented. So essentially, those with political, economic, and ideational power are able to define both what the problem is, but at the same time are able to then define what the solution to that problem is. And for me, I think the important part in what we have just heard is that we have to also, you know, especially when we're thinking about South-South cooperation, and also when we're thinking about triangular cooperation, it has to be defined from the perspective of the Global South. But also, what is also important is that as countries in the Global South interact with one another more, it is quite important that they are very conscious of how they are interacting, what the core assumptions of that interaction are, and what problems and solutions they are defining for each other. And I say this because it's important that we do not replicate that sort of colonial era thinking and that imposition of a particular model of development. I think this is quite important, that through South-South cooperation, can countries in the Global South not only, let's say, interact with one another, give credits and give loans, send volunteers to other countries and all of that, but can they redefine the very idea of development and the very models of development? Because I think what's important is that, especially for countries in the global south, they should not seek to replicate and to design models that were designed by countries in the so-called global north, because we know that many of those models of development are unsustainable. We know that many of those models are actually at the very core of many of the global systemic problems that we are seeing currently, whether economically, ecologically, and through various means, politically also. So, sort of, and it's an open question, is that can South-South cooperation not only try to replicate, let's say, North-South cooperation, but bring a uniqueness, a new insight, maybe new but ancient also. So an old insight, but also a new insight in the world of international development. And by doing that, redefine what it means to develop, but also redefine many of the assumptions of the economic and political models that we are applying to our countries. So, when I was listening to what Jose was saying, I just saw that as a challenge for those who are practicing South-South cooperation, because sometimes it can be easy to merely be replicating, existing models and existing systems. And I think the real challenge for South-South cooperation is to do things differently. And it's to challenge ourselves to look at the world differently, and to look at international development differently, to look at economic systems differently. Jose mentioned the issue of GDP. How do we measure GDP? Clearly, we are not measuring everything that needs to be measured, when we are thinking about GDP and economic growth. But I think it's the challenge for, for influential countries within the global south working with others to not provide necessarily the answers to these questions, but to create the space where we are also allowed to question the very idea of development and the very assumptions of what we mean by development. So thank you for that. I really enjoyed that input.
Thank you, Philani. If I'm allowed to answer to you, I would like to make you another question. And going back to my presentation, I would like also to think about the concept, the origins of the concept of the Global South. If we are moving beyond these systems of classification that have been operating since those centuries for representing non-European societies. The problem for me with the concept of the Global South is that it still reproduces a binary vision of the world between the North, that it's assumed that it's global, that it's developed, and the South, that it's in its way to become developed. So I think there's an epistemic problem that could translate into a real problem. Maybe we can. Is not another better concept to describe or to capture these interactions between these countries? Because I was thinking also now that not only Mexico has an ambivalent position in international economy, but South Africa as well. Mexico is considered to be part of the Global South, but is part of the Global North as well, is part of the OECD. And South Africa is part of the global south, but has been part of the BRICS also, a more larger regional association. So I was thinking also about the implications this could have, for example, in establishing the kind of relationships that would fit the partners in this relationship. Because if South cooperation means that, for example, Mexico as a regional power or South Africa as a regional power imposes its model, then we are precisely in the scenario you were talking about. So I think we have to still work at the theoretical level to bring more nuance, more I don't know the word, more detail to more precision to the kind of interactions we are trying to measure. And I loved a lot your concept of quantifying cooperation, not in monetary terms exclusively, and this could be this kind of interactions, and pretty concrete, as you said, poverty alleviation or how involvement in peace and security processes. So that's my comment.
No, that's excellent, and I think what that tells us is that certainly there is still a lot of work to do, as you're saying, at the theoretical level, at the conceptual level, because I think if we don't do that, then we run the risk of both consciously but also unconsciously replicating patterns that we ourselves have been critical of in years gone by. And I think in that sense, it's quite important to, I spoke earlier about the sort of multiple tracks of diplomacy. And I think this is why it's so important that those who are in positions of authority, policymakers, practitioners, to also create the platforms where the practitioners are also able to have these conceptual and theoretical discussions, with scholars, in the global south, but in other countries also. Because again, you mentioned something that we may characterize maybe as the trappings of language. Yeah. So we are still perhaps trapped in an old language. We still, in as much as we know that these concepts are not correct, we still characterize countries as developed and others as developing. We still characterize, others as north and others as south. And what we are not being perhaps honest with is that the assumption under these titles is that those who are developing have to catch up and look more like those who are developed, and that those in the south have to eventually develop to look and resemble more those who are in the north. But of course, if we do that, then we might need a few more planets, because our human civilization is simply not going to be able to do those very things on this very same planet. So I think it's an important challenge, right? Because in as much as governments are doing things, are cooperating, are exchanging, material material exchanges, but also ideational exchanges. I think it's important that we also take a step back and actually think and unlearn what we know from concepts such as developing, north, south, and we actually have to engage in an exercise of redefining our basic assumptions of how the world works, of global politics, of the global economy, of what it means essentially to be developed, a concept such as poverty and all of that, concepts such as foreign direct investment, at what cost, these are important things, of course, but I think it's about looking at things in a more holistic manner and then saying, how can we then put programs in place that resemble the conceptual understanding of these topics? Too often, what we are doing is we talk about the benefits, right, of South-South cooperation, that countries from the South can introduce, new ideas and so forth. But sometimes in our practice, we are actually still replicating countries that we ourselves were criticizing, for their models of development. So it's quite a challenge, but I definitely think we should not get so caught up in the practice of South-South cooperation that we then abandon some of these conceptual debates on what is the global South and what is the global North, and what does it mean if we define others as falling in the South and others in the North.
Arturo, I don't know if I have time for another question to Philani before opening.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yes, I want to go back to this theory of this catch-up theory. It's a neoliberal theory. It's the central tenets of neoliberalism, that if underdeveloped countries adopt the same model as did the northern countries, eventually they're going to catch up the most advanced countries. I want to signal to the work. I want to make reference to the work of Morten Jarven, a book he wrote. The title is Africa: Why Economists Get It Wrong. And for example, works like those of Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson, Why Nation Fails, while they acknowledge all these structural obstacles for the developing nations. For example, when they focus in the growth of a country in Africa, in the growth it has registered during a year, they center the analysis still in the distance separating this country with the most developed ones, and comparing the standard of living with those countries. So we have this always this horizon that we must arrive, as you said, this standard of living to which we must aspire. So I would like to ask you, what do you think? Because this is we have been accepting all these policies coming from the north, all these developmental models coming from the north, specifically in the last 20 years from the neoliberal theory. And what we have seen in not only in Africa but in Latin America is a failure of imposing these developmental models in these regions. And now what we have seen in the last 10 years is that governments such as the South African government or the Mexican government, for instance, have changed their strategy, a little bit their strategy, and going against the principal how do you say, premises of neoliberalism, that is the reduction of the state. There have been a lot of social programs of cash transfer in both Mexico and South Africa that are going against this neoliberal dogma, and that are yielding some results in alleviating poverty or in mitigating some vulnerable conditions of the population. But what is interesting is that they go against this idea of reducing the state capacities. That was the heart of this structural program and adjustment programs of the FMI and World Bank during the last decades. So I would like to ask you, what do you think of these new social programs that have been very popular in the southern region of Africa, but also in other parts of the world as Mexico?
Yeah, no, that's really good, because, you know, when you think about that, we have to go back to the impacts, the negative impacts that we saw in Africa of the World Bank and IMF-led structural adjustment programs, you know, of the 80s and early 90s. And it had devastating impacts. We were being fed, you know, this dogma, and it almost became a almost religious, pseudo-religious dogma that the state needed to decrease. But, you know, when you think about such advice, it was so ill-advised, because you were speaking to countries that were only at that moment still establishing state structures. So the very idea even of sovereignty, many of these countries did not really exercise even sovereignty. You know, the state actors in those countries were still trying to acquire the capacity to actually reach their population throughout the country. And here they were being told that they needed to now minimize the role of the state, that they needed to cut their social programs, that they needed to cut education, cut health, and all of that. And they were being told that they have to cut on all these key areas that are perhaps the key foundation of building a healthy society. And perhaps even this pandemic has helped us to realize the importance of the role of the state. A state that is responsible, a state that has the capacity to actually reach its citizens. And I think this pandemic has been one of those catalysts that have shifted thinking within Africa, but also in many other countries. And I think what that's going to do is it's going to spark a sort of a program of thinking strategically about how, you know, state actors need to play a more active role and a more positive role in shaping, you know, the societies that we are living in. And I think this has been really important. I mean, we are even seeing, you know, institutions that we largely branded as neoliberal. You know, even those institutions, we are now seeing them sort of adopting some of the thinking that has been coming from, you know, the so-called global South. Because many of these policy shifts that we are seeing are actually things that scholars and practitioners in the global South have been saying for years, but they did not necessarily have the material and the ideational power to become, let's say, the mainstream thinking. And I think to a certain extent, it will be interesting to see in years going ahead, to see to what extent are ideas that are developed in the global South, critical ideas on the economy, on politics, on culture, on knowledge and knowledge production, to what extent a lot of those ideas will now move into the so-called mainstream, of thinking. But, to conclude on this, I think that our countries have not always had the confidence to actually experiment with their ideas. I think we've produced a lot of great scholars who are able to critique what is actually happening and what is wrong and what could potentially, be the right way to move forward. But I think, the various state actors and governments within the global South have not always had the confidence and the conviction to actually put material resources towards some of those ideas. And perhaps, the pandemic might be one of those moments where it acts as a catalyst to say that, but you know what? A lot of these ideas we have been propagating in years gone by. And here we are, and perhaps we were correct to actually propagate those ideas. But I think it then needs to translate to governments within the global South actually putting and backing some of that thinking and not being afraid to fail sometimes, because I think sometimes we've been afraid of experimenting with ideas and being afraid, to fail and to be branded as somebody that is crazy and that is going against, the mainstream. But over time, you realize that some of those ideas that were seen to be incorrect ideas are now being found that actually those were the ideas we should have invested even earlier than we are doing now.
Thank you. Thank you to both of you. I think this is a very interesting topic, and you have made really remarkable contributions. And the discussion is actually very interesting as well. There are several questions, but I also have my own question that I would like to ask first, because then I think it links with a question that we have here. And the question that I have is what are the most prominent obstacles that South-South cooperation is facing? So I'm sure that there are challenges, and I'm not sure if the challenges are the same as the obstacles. And talking about these obstacles, what our countries are facing in terms of these obstacles to foster more South-South cooperation. And I would like to hear from both of you what you think about these obstacles might be. I don't know, whoever wants to answer.
Can I go first?
Yeah.
Well, I think to answer your question, the main obstacle I already told during my presentation is the mutual ignorance that we have about our societies. The ignorance of Latin America, of African societies by Latin American societies, and the other way around. Some issues are also related to the language. I mean, in South Africa, the main language is English, but this could be a challenge for other countries of the global South that are not English speaking, for example. And then the other obstacle, it's the structures, the historical structures of the hegemonic capitalist system, and still the role played by the great powers in this system. So I think there is an epistemic challenge, as I told, that involves all the Latin American societies and African societies to design a better education system. I think a better high education institutions, because the university, as I said before, has worked for the reproduction of the system, for not critiquing, for not being enough critical of this system. So I think the main challenge is at the educational level, so that the university, the institution of the university, doesn't represent a reproduction of the status quo, but a revolutionary space where we can learn more about global South societies, so that we can get a better picture and better understanding of the social dynamics, and then devise better ways of cooperating. That's my opinion.
Yeah, I think also maybe let me just build on from that. I think, you know, sometimes you still see, for instance, institutions of higher learning in South Africa and across Africa. And in their official documents, sometimes they are saying that they want to become the Harvard of Africa, or they want to become the Oxford, you know, of Africa. Now that is problematic. But, you know, and of course, with all the acknowledgements and the respect, you know, for institutions such as Harvard and Oxford. But I think the challenge for us is, how do we create not you know, universities in Africa, but how do we create African universities? You know, and because, I mean, we have to be conscious of the fact that if we are trying to be the Oxford of Africa, or to be the Harvard of Africa, then what we are simply doing is just replicating what those institutions have actually done already. And we are just trying to replicate them here. So in their own thinking, what we are subjecting ourselves to is to a peripheral role in the global production of knowledge. And we are saying we are happy to be a mirror image, even if not to be the original, but to be a mirror image and a reflection of something, you know, that we can never, you know, truly attain. So I think the challenge is to rethink development, and to rethink many of the theories and academic programs that we have in our institutions, so that we do not have to, and I think this is an opportunity for South-South cooperation. And that's one of the reasons why it was conceptualized, is because we understood, at least countries in the South understood, and the proponents of South-South cooperation understood, that the challenge at the time, or the problem at the time, was that many of our interactions were mediated through a Northern partner. So I understood Mexico by reading the New York Times and understanding what is happening in Mexico. I understood Mexico by going to The Economist magazine and reading what I view as a credible source of information, which then gives me a translation of what Mexico is and what's happening in Mexico, what are the dynamics, who are the role players, and so forth, and vice versa. Mexicans would understand Africa and understand South Africa through a lens that is created by Europe and by the US. And again, I say this again, this is not to, invalidate, the work of those institutions, those newspapers, those magazines. They play an important role, but they should not be our most important source of trying to get to know each other. And I think once we can break down those barriers and have in South Africa real academic and programs that are dedicated to understanding Latin America, and that are working directly with stakeholders in Latin America, and where we can then eventually also mobilize whatever resources are necessary, mobilize them domestically, and not need to have a South Africa-Mexico exchange program funded by the European Union, but where we can actually have that program, but where we can fund it, even if not to that scale, but fund it by channeling resources domestically in South Africa and channeling resources in Mexico. And when I say resources, I'm not talking only about financial resources. Here we're engaging in this topic, exchanging ideas, and we have all dedicated our resources. We've dedicated our time. We've dedicated our commitment to actually to this topic. So I think we need to think like that and to say, how do we break down some of those barriers and begin to understand each other from our own vantage point? Because even as we embark on South-South initiatives, some countries in the global north are continuing to try to influence us and to say, no, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't do that. That is bad practice or things like that. So, let us experiment on our own. Let us discover on our own whether our practices are good or whether our practices are bad. And let us design evaluation tools on our own and say, this is how we are going to evaluate the type of work that we are doing. And I think if we do that, we can break down a number of the obstacles to South-South cooperation.
Thank you. Yeah, when you were saying that, how they influence also whatever we do, it's unfortunately sometimes when the resources come from the global north, then we are tied. So then we have to sort of comply with what they want to do things. So it's, as you say, we have to do things with our own resources, no matter how small they are. Okay, so this leads to one of the questions of, I think it was when you were talking, Philani, about the different organizations that found cooperation. So the question is, what other organizations facilitate and fund South-South cooperation? But then I would also like to hear from your side in South Africa, but also in Mexico, Jose Luis. What organizations? Because I think you were talking about Philani and South African Development Agency, and then you also referred to AMEXID. But are there other organizations that facilitate this South-South cooperation?
Yeah, no, good question. In fact, I think that this is a great opportunity for South-South cooperation because there are increasingly organizations that are funding. So in the South African sense, yes, you've got the African Renaissance Fund, but you've also got development finance institutions in South Africa, such as the Development Bank of Southern Africa. You've also got the Industrial Development Corporation. And I think this ecosystem, so the African Renaissance Fund, or in future, what would become a South African Development Partnership Agency, it needs to then interact with structures like the Development Bank of Southern Africa and the Industrial Development Corporation. But also there's a lot of interesting funding also at a track 2 level for research and scholarship in South-South cooperation. So you've got now interesting institutions such as your BRICS think tank, you've got your national research foundations, you've got your National Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences. These are all funding very important work in South-South cooperation. And I think all of these tools can actually be used, to do some of the things that we've been discussing, to take forward South-South cooperation. And then beyond that, I think you've got countries that are supporting structures such as your export and import banks. So China, India has got an export and import bank, which they use to fund infrastructure projects and other projects across the continent. You've also got increasingly within the Global South structures like your IPSA fund between India, South Africa, and Brazil. You've also got your BRICS New Development Bank, which is now also a development finance institution, and that is also attracting new membership now. And then even further afield, even structures like your Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. I think these are all structures that have the resources to align the ideational aspects of South-South cooperation with the material resources. And these are all structures that could be used to actually change our models of development, but to also to change our thinking on how we actually define development.
Thank you. Jose Luis?
Well, really, to be honest, I don't know. Besides the AMEXID, the Public Agency for Development, I certainly there must be a lot of charity organizations and private funds that are channeled to developmental projects. But to be honest, I don't know the situation of the actors of development in Mexico. But I think it's also important that I want to ask once more Philani what he thinks about the role that Mexico and South Africa should play in their respective regions to develop also cooperation, but between regions. I don't know if I made myself clear, but for example, to involve not only South Africa, but the SADC, the organization, the regional organization, with a dialogue, for example, with the US, Mexican, Canadian Free Treaty Agreement. If it's part of this process of scaling up the development diplomacy and South-South cooperation, this trying to also have an impact at the organization, regional organizations level.
Oh, excellent. Can I just jump in there, because I think this regional dynamic is also quite important, because I actually just finished a short paper now on the regional dimension. And the argument there was that if one of the things that the pandemic taught us was that we actually need to have and to strengthen the cooperation that's happening at a regional level. So, African countries were exposed because they were at the back of the line when it came to procuring important medicines, vaccines, PPEs. Why? Because they simply did not have the regional value chains that were going to be important to provide, these goods and products and services. And so when the pandemic hit, it's not that African countries did not have the money to buy vaccines. It's not that they didn't have the money to buy protective equipment. It's not that they didn't have money to buy ventilators and all of that. They had the money, but they didn't have access to the supply chains because, you know, countries that were closer to these global value chains were looking at themselves and their own populations first. And I think if that has to inspire something, it is to focus on how can South-South cooperation be a catalyst for greater regional cooperation. Because I think if we have more cooperation at a regional level, we will also create more resilient societies and more resilient regions that are able to cope with a future pandemic or a future global crisis, because we would have built up the regional capacities that are not isolated from those global value chains. So I mean, I think that is essentially, you know, the medium, certainly the medium future. We do need to strengthen cooperation at a regional level. And in fact, when you look at Africa, there's still a lot of growth for cooperation. We're only trading 20% intra-Africa trade, 18 to 20%. So there's still a lot of room for growth. And that's why mechanisms such as the African Continental Free Trade Area are going to be a very critical site for South-South cooperation moving forward.
Thank you. There is another question, I think, because I don't have it specifically for whom, but I think this is for Jose Luis, because you were talking about capitalism. Do you not think that capitalism can help in facilitating triangular cooperation? Or if it facilitates, how?
Yeah, I think that we cannot skew capitalism as we cannot skew these methodologies, these epistemologies, these Eurocentric epistemologies. I want to cite here Dipesh Chakrabarty, this subaltern thinker of India, when he says that Eurocentric epistemologies are at once indispensable but inadequate to approach the world dynamics. So I think that, for example, what is missing in these models of development imposed in African societies and Latin American societies is precisely this contact with the culture, with the culture of the countries. These models do not take into consideration the realities, the cultural realities of those countries, and we have to know them better. We have to know, for example, what is called the informal sector from an economic perspective. We have to do much and better research about the dynamics going on in this sector, and we cannot ignore them because in Africa and much part of Latin America, they represent the most of the economic activity, and we do not make the effort to study them because we consider them to be outside the official channels of the capitalist system. So, but I think that a lot of communities and a lot of pre-colonial characteristics of societies, either in Africa or Latin America, are still at work. And they, as I said before, they do not respond to this logic, exclusively to this logic of profits of capitalism. They for example, the Murid Brotherhood in Senegal, an Islamic Sufi movement, they put a system of economic accumulation based on religious institutions that go beyond these models of capitalism coming from Western societies. So I think that we cannot skew capitalism, as I said before, but we have to adapt it to local realities and cultural dynamics going on in the countries.
Thank you. Sorry, if you don't mind, if there are two questions, I think they are interesting, and then we can finish this talk. It's quite long. I'm going to write it, to copy it on the chat, and then I will also read it. Do you believe? I think this is for you, Philani. Do you believe that the diversification of political and economic partnerships through establishing South-South cooperation can provide the necessary counterbalance to the present models in place?
I definitely think South-South cooperation can assist with that, because what it can do is to actually also provide greater agency for countries of the global South. So by working together, it can also enhance one of the priorities of South-South cooperation, which is to have greater policy space. So if we increase, the interaction at a South-South level, then it gives countries in the South greater agency. And of course, this is something that is going to happen also gradually, because even when we just think about our traditional North-South relations, the moment that you have an increasing amount of South-South cooperation, it actually over time can reduce the dependency of developing countries on the global North. But this is not necessarily about, moving away from the North or isolating oneself from the North. It is about being in a position to interact with the North and with the South, but, as equals, essentially, to be able to have the type of policy space to define your own system of development, to define what is necessary politically, economically, and to begin to unravel some of those structural impediments of development. And I think over time and pursued, correctly, South-South cooperation can definitely enhance agency, act as a counterweight, but also enable countries of the South to define their own development models and to define the type of international partnerships they want to engage with. So they would not be dependent on only being having relations with countries in the North, which can only be good, I think, for both countries in the South, but also I think for countries in the North. Because if we think about it, for many decades, the world relied on a very small amount of countries for intellectual leadership and for development models. So we relied on a very small population in the world. So when you expand that space beyond your OECD Development Assistance Committee countries, and you include ideas coming from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America, I think that can only enrich the global discourse on development and on systems of development.
Thank you, Philani. And the last question, I'm also going to write it down in the chat. I'm going to read it. You made mention of metrics other than monetary measurement of development and international cooperation. Could you please provide examples of alternative metrics that could possibly be used?
Okay, perfect. So I think this also goes sort of against this idea that we have to monetize everything. And I'll give an example. Let's say South Africa sends civil servants to Malawi to work on improving their output, let's say in potatoes production for food security. Now, if a South African civil servant gets paid, I don't know, let me say 50,000, just put out a figure. Let's say they get paid 50,000 in rands. Then if you wanted to quantify that, you would then quantify it based on their salary, based on the amount of hours they spend there. Now you take another example of a German civil servant going to the same project, doing the same things, and perhaps actually having less experience at working under those conditions in Malawi. But what tends to happen is that because the German civil servant is paid higher wages, and then if we quantified it in monetary terms, you could argue that Germany was producing or what was actually providing more development assistance than a South African who was doing the same thing, simply because they are paid in different currencies and they are paid and they have different salary rates and so forth. But that is incorrect. There are other ways that we can quantify the impact of that same South African civil servant that goes to provide capacity building, in Malawi, in a way that doesn't necessarily have to rely on a financialization of that. So we can measure impact in different ways. We can use more, we don't have to only rely on quantitative figures. We can rely also on qualitative input, on feedback from the stakeholders in Malawi who can actually tell us about the impact of that project and whether they found value in that project. So we can use more qualitative measures, but at the same time also, when you send a peacekeeping operation, for instance, which does not have a mandate, of course, of using offensive weapons, but you are bringing about, maybe you are stabilizing a situation which has emerged, from conflict. Yes, you can quantify and say that it costed us this much to move this many army vehicles from South Africa to the DRC. This is how many flights we took. This is how much petrol we put in the cars. But that may not necessarily be the best measure because what impact are we actually having on the ground, in the communities? Are we taking forward, the process of development? And I think these are some of the questions that we need to ask ourselves, that by quantifying and by monetizing, sometimes we are creating a condition where we are comparing things that are not necessarily comparable. And also by doing that, we then say that countries in the North are providing more than they are, than, for instance, countries in the global South. But it all depends on what measures we are actually using. And I think we can do a bit more work at rethinking how we monitor, how we evaluate South-South cooperation, and how we also quantify, both financially, but also in a non-financial manner.
Thank you very much, both of you, for this wonderful talk and discussion around South-South cooperation. Would you like to give some really short concluding remarks? Jose Luis, would you like to say something? Philani, are we good?
Yes.
Just very short.
To thank you, Arturo, for inviting me, for getting to know Philani, and really looking forward to cooperate with him and his think tank. And it has been a pleasure for me being here with you this morning.
Thank you.
No, thank you, colleagues. Also on my side, I think I've really enjoyed this exchange. Thank you, Arturo, and thank you, Jose. This has, I think, been a very rich conversation. I've certainly learned a lot, both in the operational elements, but also on the conceptual elements. And I think this is quite important. And I definitely look forward to taking this conversation forward.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for everyone who were watching us. Until next time, thank you. Have a good evening. Have a good afternoon, Jose Luis.